the sales booster is something you should definitely make part of your overall launch when you're doing a launch, because just because people don't sign up for the webinar, or if you're doing a challenge or something like that, doesn't necessarily mean they don't want your product. They could have just been busy. So make sure to include that in any launch you do.
Welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, where host and renegade-thinking beer-brewing lawyer turned online entrepreneur Bobby Klinck proves that building and protecting your online genius doesn't have to be rocket science. Bobby and his expert guests break down online marketing and the legal stuff so you can stop sweating the small stuff and get back to building your amazing business. Now, here's your host, Bobby Klinck.
Hey there. Welcome to episode 65 of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klinck. I'm really excited for today's show because it's one of my favorite kinds of episodes. I'm going to give you a recap of my recent launch, including the key lessons learned. Now, I have to say, back when I started this podcast, I never imagined doing these kinds of episodes, but I did my first one back in May of last year after I did my first proper launch, at least the first launch where I actually sold anything. And when I did it, I was really kind of surprised to learn that people loved it. It really was my most popular episode ever at the time. What I figured out is that people like you really want to hear kind of real stories from the trenches and how I'm building my business. And so I've made it a habit and to do these kind of recaps. So this is a recap of my first launch of 2019. And I'm going to give you all the gory details and information about kind of what worked, what didn't work, and some of those things so that maybe it can help you as you're thinking about launching your products this year. But before we get there, this week's episode, as always, is brought to you by the Online Genius podcast community on Facebook. I tell you every week, and I'm going to keep telling you, that's where we can go deeper. I love talking with you and giving you lessons here on the podcast. But the community is where we can actually go back and forth. We can have more interaction. And with respect to this week's episode, it's really obvious how, hey, if you have questions about my launch, if you're curious about things, if you want more details, you're going to be able to get it in that community. And also, just so you know, I actually posted a debrief document in the community that has a lot of these numbers, a lot of these results. So you could see that, get access to that Google Doc if you're interested. So I hope you'll join me there, and you can do it there. It's absolutely free. All you got to do is head over to youronlinegenius.com/community. Again, youronlinegenius.com/community, and you can join me there and we can have discussions. You can ask me questions and we can go a bit deeper. So with that, let's dive in. Now, I want to start with an overview of what I was launching and how I was launching it. So this was a launch for my signature product, the Online Genius Template Library. The offer basically is that when you buy, you get all of my existing legal templates. You get access to a private Facebook group. This is different than the community, which is only for people who have bought the template library or people who had bought a membership before that I no longer offer. Then you also get access to all my future templates. In other words, if I introduce a new kind of legal template, tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, or even a year from now, anyone who has bought the template library is going to get access to that. So the way I like to say it is it's kind of a, one-stop shop, all access pass where you can fill your legal toolbox with all the templates that you should need. And people who buy this will literally never have to buy another legal template from me, because if I ever have another legal template, it will be included. So the price point for the product is $997, and there is a 12-pay option at $97 a month. So that's kind of the standard offer. But I should mention, I also had a pre-sale where people on a wait list could get access and buy at a $150 discount for a short window of time. And, the idea behind that was, hey, let's kind of prime the pump, if you will. So that's the offer in a nutshell. And I should mention, I wouldn't be a good marketer if I didn't mention this. You shouldn't be following me if I didn't say this. If you're hearing this and saying, I might want to be on the wait list for the next time you launch this product, you can do that by going to youronlinegenius.com/library. That'll just make sure you hear about the next time I launch the product, and you'll be the first to hear. You'll have access to that discount if it's something that you might be interested in. Again, just go to youronlinegenius.com/library if you're interested. Now back to the actual programming here. So the launch itself, I like to say, had 3 different parts. First was the pre-sale to the waitlist. That was a 3-day event, just emails. There was nothing else. I sent 1 email on day 1, 1 email on day 2, and 1 email on day 3. No ads. There was no webinar. There was nothing. It was just those emails. Then I had a standard webinar funnel with a 7-day open cart. We started ads to get people to the webinar about 9 days beforehand, and I sent multiple emails to my list. I think I sent 4, maybe 5. I can't remember. I think 4 dedicated emails inviting people to the webinar, but then I referenced it in a couple of my weekly emails with just, in the PS line. So that was the standard part of that. And then after the webinar, there was a promo sequence as part of the webinar funnel that I think, I don't have the final number, but I think it was like 12 emails was the standard sequence. But then there were a few extras thrown in here and there, including on, I don't know, it would have been on day like 5 or 6, or I guess 4 or 5, I think 5. On Sunday, I sent an email to anyone who had kind of interacted, who had clicked on the link and gone to the landing page, that basically just invited them, hey, I see that you did that. If you have any questions, I'm around. I'm watching football this weekend. Happy to answer any questions you have. So I added that one kind of on the fly. So that was the standard sequence. Again, it was 1 email a day until the last couple of days, where there was 2 and then I think 3 on the cart close day. Then the final part of the launch is the sales booster series to my list. This is something I learned from my friend Amy Porterfield. And the idea is that if you ignore your overall list, so if you just basically focus all of your promotion efforts on people who sign up for your webinar, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. You should have something that also, it's not as in-depth as your promo sequence that you're sending to your webinar folks, but you should tell your overall list about the product, the sale, etc. Maybe they missed the emails about the webinar. Maybe they just don't like webinars, but they might still want to buy. So that was the final piece. I had 3 emails, or I guess 4 emails that everyone got it as part of that. I believe 3 or 4. I can't remember exactly. And no, I think it was 4. So there was, one the day the cart opened, then one a couple days later, then one the day before it closed or something. And then on cart close day, I did something interesting, sent my list my phone number and said, hey, I got cart closing today. If you're interested, feel free to reach out, send me a text and we can chat. So that was kind of the last thing. Then anyone who had interacted, so who had opened or clicked or done something on some of those ads, or not those ads, sorry, those emails, got a couple more emails, I think, on cart close day, just to make sure they were aware of it. So that was the sales booster sequence that I sent to my overall list. Now let's talk about the overall results, because this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. I ended up making 51 sales for a total booked revenue of $52,590. And the way we get to that number is that assumes that everyone who signed up for a payment plan will finish it out and make those payments. Again, there are no refunds on this product, so I don't have to worry about thinking about refunds, but I will probably realistically have some people who don't finish up their payment plans. It's a reality of the business. But if everyone does, it'll be $52,590. Because the payment plans, you end up paying a little more than the $997. I netted a little bit above $1,000 per sale. And again, there were also a couple of places here where, for example, a couple of people had bought some individual templates that do have a refund policy less than 30 days before the launch. And so they reached out, and rather than doing something crazy where, for example, I said, okay, we'll refund that and then buy it at full price, I just created coupon codes for them. So this is the actual revenue after taking account of those kinds of discounts that those folks got. Now, here's how it broke down between the parts of the launches. Again, remember we talked about the pre-sale, the webinar, and then the sales booster. I made 6 sales during the pre-sale for revenue of $4,879, but round figures $5,000. I made 23 sales to webinar registrants and netted a little bit or somewhere between $24,000 and $25,000 in revenue there. And then I made 22 sales in the sales booster sequence and netted right around $21,000 in revenue from that. So you can see a solid amount in the pre-sale and then kind of an even split on the number of sales between my webinar registrants and my sales booster sequence. So that's how they broke down. Now let's kind of walk through those in a little more depth. The pre-launch was a powerhouse here. I only had 30 people on that wait list because I hadn't really promoted it much. The only way people really got on it was at the end of my welcome sequence to folks who kind of were new to my list. And then also I think there were some people who I'd kind of launched this last October, but without webinars. And some people at the end of that ended up getting on my wait list then. But with 30 people on the list making 6 sales, I mean, that's a 20% conversion rate, which is pretty astounding, especially because it was just emails. And here's the really crazy thing. My earnings per lead for people on that list was $162. In other words, every person who was on that list was worth $162 to me. That is a number that any marketer would basically die for because it is a huge value to have those people on the list. So that was something that was kind of a revolution or a revelation. And like I said, it was a powerhouse. Again, another good part of it was because that there were no ads, there was nothing like that. And the pre-sale actually happened the week before or right as we were starting ads. So basically, as we were starting ads, I already had money coming in the door. And by the middle of the week, I had basically paid a big chunk of my ads cost. So that was a nice little bonus that came with it as well. So now let's talk about the webinar. The webinar itself performed well. I had 435 people register for the webinar. Once I kind of went through the list and excluded the people who had already bought this product before, because I don't consider them part of my launch list because I couldn't really sell it to them again, but they're on my list and wanted to go through the webinar. And so I had 435 people once you remove those people. And like my name was on the list. I took myself off, obviously, and my ads person, et cetera. So that was the number. The launch list size was 435 people. And I sold 23 of the library product to that list. That's a sales conversion rate of about a little over 5%, 5.3%. It's not too bad. I mean, I'd like to increase that, but it's actually a pretty good result once you consider that, you have 435 people who register, but then only say 30%, I think, is about how many showed up. It was 28 or 29%, I think, on average showed up for the webinar. And so you start just kind of netting down from there, and you can see that, ending up getting 5% of the total people to ultimately buy is actually a pretty good result. And my earnings per lead for people who registered for the webinar, again, this is an important metric that marketers want to look at because you want to know how much is a lead worth to me. And so everyone who registered for my webinar on average was worth $56.55 for me. Now, I'd like to get that higher, but it's a number that most people would be very, very happy with. Again, if you get to the $40 and $50 earnings per lead, you're generally doing good. That's a sign that your webinar is good, your offer's on point, and all of those things. So again, that is a very good sign that things were working well once people were in my funnel. Now, I also ended up adding 250 new people to my email list from the webinar registrations. So that 435, a lot of those people were people who were on my list who either responded to an ad to warm audience or responded to an email I sent inviting them. But I added, I think, on that about 250 people. Now, again, you can probably imagine I had a lot of people unsubscribe during this process because I was sending a lot of emails. But I have new people, which is always good, and I will continue to nurture those people, especially, everyone's going to get nurtured. And so people who didn't buy this time around may end up buying the next time I launch, which is how I like to think about it. You're always thinking not just about this launch, but what's happening 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, etc. So that's the webinar and how it performed. Now let's talk about the sales booster sequence. The sales booster sequence was a revelation for me. This is everyone who didn't register for the webinar. And again, I think it ended up being about 4,000 people on my list at the beginning who didn't register. And that means, because again, I made 22 sales for about $21,000 in revenue. That means that everybody on my email list who didn't register for the webinar was still worth $5 to me during this one launch. And if you think about it, you hear these general numbers that people on your list are worth $1 per month. Well, I kind of proved that you can be higher than that if you're actually doing things right. So the sales booster sequence, again, was a revelation for me. Some people looked at this and said, well, maybe you don't even need to do a webinar. I like doing webinars, so I'm going to keep doing them, obviously. But it's a good sign that there are people on my list who, even without going through a webinar, are going to buy my product. Maybe they knew it was coming. Maybe these are people who had heard me talk about the product before, and so they said, hey, I want that. And so when they saw me offer it, they said, okay, good, I'm going to buy. Maybe they're people who just kind of missed the webinar invites because they were busy or something like that. And so then they saw the offer and the product they wanted, so they went ahead and bought. But the sales booster is something you should definitely make part of your overall launch when you're doing a launch, because just because people don't sign up for the webinar, or if you're doing a challenge or something like that, doesn't necessarily mean they don't want your product. They could have just been busy. So make sure to include that in any launch you do. Now, let's talk expenses, because hearing about revenue is great, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you made money. And this was a very profitable launch for me. So again, remember my total revenue was $52,590. I think I said, $52,590. My total expenses, and this is actually kind of overestimating, but my total expenses, I put at $12,621. And almost all of that was Facebook ad costs. So that includes the fee to my ads manager for December and January. I have her now managing my account every month. So I included both of those months in the fee. Then I spent right around $6,500 in actual ad costs to Facebook. Then I also had $500 that I paid to a contract virtual assistant to help me with some things because I was busy and couldn't do it. Basically helped me with some social media during the launch. And then I included the $500 yearly expense for my webinar software, which again, really, I shouldn't include the whole year. I should include a quarter because I'm going to do multiple launches this year, but I went ahead and included it all. So overall, my profit from this launch ended up right around $40,000. That's not too bad. It's a nice month for just about anybody. So I was happy with those results. Now, since I mentioned Facebook ads, what I want to do now is kind of take a deeper dive into Facebook ads, because I know a lot of people ask me about this. I see questions about this all the time in the groups I'm in. So I think it's an important thing to talk about. I want to start by saying that my ads manager and I were continually frustrated about the results here, but we did learn some important lessons. And again, when I say we're frustrated, it's just that we weren't getting the results that either one of us really wanted to see. And hopefully, you'll have, great results when you run Facebook ads. I always have some theories about this. I think part of the problem is that, quite honestly, entrepreneurs aren't sitting around thinking to themselves, what I really want is to go to a webinar about the legal stuff. Or, what I really want is to deal with my legal stuff. I just don't think that's something that entrepreneurs are thinking about. So for me, kind of getting them to pay attention can be tough. Quite honestly, getting people to really even say, okay, I want to pay attention to this can be hard. So we see that repeatedly in my ads. And I want to make clear, I think my Facebook ads manager did a fine job. And we tried a lot of different things, and we found things that worked, and we turned off things that weren't working. It's just the nature of things. I've had lots of different Facebook ads managers, and every single time we've been frustrated about the process because it just is what it is. But I do want to say, even though we were frustrated, we had a positive return on ad spend. for every dollar I put in, I got that dollar back and then another $1.46 back. So that's what's called your return on ad spend was $2.46. So every dollar I spent, I ultimately got $2.46 back, which is okay. I mean, it's not great. I mean, if you could do that every day of the week, you would, right? I mean, you would gladly go ahead and take that kind of return and just spend lots of money. You want that number to be higher. And going towards my next launch, we're obviously going to try to make it higher. But, it at least means that we made money on the ads, which is a good thing. And in total, 16 of my sales were directly traceable to the Facebook ads. So 16 out of the 51 sales, you could look and say, okay, this was someone who clicked on one of the ads at some point, and the sale is traceable back to those ads. So again, when you do the math there, let's just use $1,000 round number. That means $16,000 from Facebook ads for a spend of $6,500. That's about where you get that 2.46 return from. Again, let's go a little bit more granular here. Most of the budget went to get people to register for the webinar. We spent about $5,000 of the $6,500 budget there. And we paid an average of $24.50 per registration. That is way more than I wanted to spend. It's more than the average. Again, I attribute this to kind of where I am. You have to keep in mind, my ads are competing with people like Amy Porterfield's ads, and Amy's programs, are things that, let's be honest, most entrepreneurs want more than mine. Now, my product definitely fills a need. But if you think about it, if you hear, ooh, I can build an online course, or ooh, I can deal with the legal stuff, which one sounds more attractive? Well, for the most part, people can say, oh, I want to build an online course. So it's part of my life that I have to deal with, and I accept that. We are going to try to bring that down, obviously. But again, considering that each webinar registrant was worth $56 to me. Remember earlier I talked about my earnings per lead, and for the webinar funnel, it was $56.55 per lead. That means, again, we were making money on each one of these registrations because there's a difference there of about $32. So again, I put 24 in and get 56 back. That's a pretty good deal. So it was profitable. Not hugely so, but it was profitable. And also, there were some bright spots. There were some ad sets and a decent number getting a good number of registrations that were getting anywhere between $10 and $18 leads throughout the entire campaign. And when you actually looked at it, kind of especially by the end, that those $18 ones were kind of cheaper. So we're hopeful that next time around, we can bring the average down to the $15 mark. That's much closer to where I want to be. And when you think about it, if I can put $15 in and get $56 back, there you're getting closer to a 4-to-1 return, which is a good place to be. Now, when you kind of looked at the different ad sets, we started out with 10 different ad sets, meaning we were targeting 10 different buckets of people, and we were running a ton of different creatives to those different audiences to see what worked. What we found is that we had a really tough time reaching cold audiences. People who weren't already in my world somehow were tough to reach. Now, that's always the case, but that's where we had some of these really, crazy high numbers that actually skewed the overall average up to that $24.50 per lead. I mean, there were some that were just, ridiculous, and we had to turn them off, obviously. And again, when you look at kind of the numbers behind the numbers, and if you're not someone who cares about Facebook ads yet, or ever going to do it yourself, this stuff won't mean much for you. But if you're someone who's at least dabbled in it, you'll understand this. My relevance scores were not good. On average, I had a 3. You want to be up in the 8s. I'll tell you, I have a tough time ever getting up in the 8s, but, I was on average 3. My click-through rate was below 1%. That's the number or percentage of people who see your ad who click through. You want that to be at least above 1%. I've heard different ads managers say different things, but people tend to believe that if you're below 1%, you end up getting kind of penalized. Well, I was at 0.6, so that was not good. The cost per click was high. I was on average paying, I think it was $7.50 to get someone to click on my ad. Well, if you think about that, if you're paying $7.50 on average for a click, it's going to be tough to end up in that, $10 to $15 range for registrations where you want, unless, your landing page is so good that everybody signs up, which just doesn't happen. So that was kind of where I was having trouble. Now, the good news was once I got the click, people responded well. My landing page conversion was pretty good, and especially for warm audiences. And then my kind of conversion rates and everything else that happened once people registered was also good. So what that tells us is that where we need to focus a lot of our time for the next launch is improving that front end of the funnel. Rather than, tinkering too much with the back end of the funnel, the big part of what we need to do is say, okay, how can we get more people in at a more reasonable rate? If we can do that, things could really explode the next time I launch this product. So that's kind of where we were seeing things. And again, I'll talk about this in a little bit about kind of how we're probably going to change, things going forward when I get to the key learnings. But that's kind of the facts when you look at it. Now, the other part of my ads were for retargeting. This is basically ads that were once the cart was open. This was exclusively to warm audiences. We were not running these to any cold audiences. So it was anyone who had registered for the webinar, anyone who had engaged with my page, anyone who had, visited my website, anyone on my list who had not bought. So this was basically people already in my world some way or another. Again, it would include people who'd watched only a little bit of a video on Facebook, but they at least were warm to me. And we ran a bunch of different ads here. We ran, standard cart open ads. We ran some testimonial ads. We ran some cart closing ads. We ran some ads inviting people to send a message on Messenger if they had questions. Overall, the return on ad spend here was much better. It was almost 7. So it was almost put $1 in, get $7 back total, which is much closer to where you want to be. So again, these were very profitable. And the sales page conversion, so once someone clicked on one of those ads and got to my sales page, was almost 3%. And you might be saying, well, that doesn't sound very good. It actually is a very good number for a sales page conversion rate for a $1,000 product. So again, that was a very good sign. When we looked at the specific ads, there were some interesting things here. Number one, these testimonials, people love them. And I did this during my webinar. I actually, instead of me walking through case studies, I actually played these video testimonials from people. And I got a lot of comments that people absolutely loved the way I did that. And so I would have thought that those testimonial ads would have done well. We didn't get a single sale from a testimonial ad, and they didn't even really perform well. So we're going to assess that and think about that for the next launch. And then the other thing that was really weird was that the Messenger ads, not a single person sent a Messenger. And that really kind of stunned my Facebook ads manager. She said, I think she said she had never seen that before. It was just weird. So we're going to do a dive there and try and figure out, well, why is that literally no one wanted to reach out via that? Now, I had some people reach out to me via Messenger, but it was not in response to one of those ads. So some people who knew me one way or the other, I think, did reach out to me, but none because of those ads directly. Another thing that was interesting was that when we got to the sales phase, so back in the registration period to get people on the webinar, I think it performed about the same between Instagram and Facebook placements. Once we got to the retargeting ads, Instagram ads didn't perform. It was the Facebook ads that performed. The Instagram just didn't do anything. So again, my ads manager and I, we're still kind of in this, what I call the autopsy of figuring out what we're going to do next time. But I think we're considering next time we may, only do Facebook placements for retargeting ads. We may do a little bit on Instagrams and see, but we're going to focus mainly on Facebook, given that that's where it seems to have worked. Now, the last thing I want to talk about the Facebook ads is that the demographic data was interesting too. As always, my results were better among women than men. I had cheaper leads and more sales. I like to attribute this to the fact that women on this issue at least are smarter than men. And I say that kind of jokingly sometimes, but I actually mean it. Women tend to be smarter about wanting to make sure they're protected on things like this, whereas men can be a bit too cavalier. Again, those are general statements, but my marketing, my results have shown it over and over again. My audience has always skewed more heavily towards women than to men, even when we do, even amounts of ads, etc. So that trend continued. It's an important thing that obviously can affect when you're thinking about messaging, etc. You need to know, is your market, where are they demographically? Now on age, the leads skewed to kind of the younger part of the demographic. So it was in two different Facebook brackets that basically that went from 25 to 44 years old. So Facebook breaks things down by 10-year brackets in spaces. So my leads were primarily from the 25 to 44 bracket. Now, sales, on the other hand, skewed to the more experienced folks, 45 to 64. So there's kind of this disconnect, which again, my ads manager and I now have to try to interpret that and figure out what we're going to do about that. One approach would be to say, well, we're going to focus our ads on the 45 to 64 bracket, even at the beginning going forward, because, hey, maybe we'll pay a little bit more per lead, but they're more likely to buy. But when you think about also the breakdown of how the sales ads worked when it came to placement, this also makes sense, right? Because Instagram tends to be younger than Facebook's demographic. So the fact that on retargeting ads, pretty much, I think all my sales came from Facebook rather than Instagram. It's not all that surprising that I would have an older demographic for buyers than for my leads. Again, we haven't made any final decisions, but it's an interesting fact that we have to try to figure out how, what do we do with that? How does that affect marketing going forward? And I give you all these details. You obviously don't need to know them, what my details were, but to give you a sense of the kinds of things I'm looking at and dissecting when I'm doing my debrief, so that I can kind of improve my marketing, so that you can ask these same kinds of questions when you're doing launches and you're doing your debriefs afterwards, because I think it's important for you to do that. So, these numbers, again, you don't care about my specific numbers necessarily, but the way I'm doing this analysis hopefully has been helpful for you. So now I want to shift to kind of the 5 key learnings that I've made so far. And there will be more once I continue to dissect this, but there are 5 key things that I learned for going forward. The first one is all about the presale. My presale was, just gangbusters. Again, it wasn't a huge part of the revenue. It was about $5,000. But considering that I only had 30 people on that list, I did nothing to nurture them, and they were still worth $162 per person on that list. That's pretty impressive. And so I take that and I say, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is try to do better at what I'm already doing well. And so I know that going forward, I need to put more emphasis on that list. I need to nurture those folks. I need to make it a bigger part of things. I need to invite more people onto that list more consistently. That's why I invited you earlier in this episode. And that's why I'm going to tell you again, if you think you might be interested in this, I'd love for you to join that wait list, which you can do by going to youronlinegenius.com/library. I'm going to do that more than I have in the past because I recognize how important that was. And again, it wasn't just the value of it, etc., but another piece of it that was really good was that I had already paid a big part of my Facebook ads budget with my presale. Effectively, because I sold almost $5,000 during that presale, I was only kind of underwater in Facebook ads right on launch day, because that's where I'd spent $5,000 in ads for webinar registrations and had made a little less than $5,000 in sales. I quickly got above water again because I made sales that first day. But that essentially meant that I was never looking at a bunch of money going out before money was coming in. And that's just a nice feeling. It gives you confidence. It makes things feel nicer. It makes it easier for you to be willing to spend money on Facebook ads to invest in your launch. So I would highly recommend, if there's a way that you can think up a pre-sale that you should do it. And in my case, I need to improve the process. I need to nurture those folks more. And I'm trying to figure that piece out now. So my first learning is I need to put more emphasis on my pre-sale, meaning get more people on the list, nurture them better, etc. And I'm going to think through, should I change the sequence in any way, shape, or form? So that's key learning number one. Key learning number two has to do with where I'm going to spend my ads budget going forward with Facebook. Now, I spend money every month to build my list, and I have been for a while. But I've always spent the majority of my budget during launch time when I'm doing these launches, right? And so that's just the reality. That's the way most people view it. What I'm learning by looking at these results is I think that's a mistake because the cold audiences simply did not respond during this launch phase, which makes sense, right? Getting someone who doesn't know me at all to actually, sign up for a webinar and then buy from me and pay me $1,000 in a short period of time is going to be tough. On the other hand, I have built a connection with people on my list. People on my list are my followers. They enjoy me and they were much more willing to buy. And you see that both in the response to ads for people registering for the webinar, but then also even for my sales booster. But again, let's keep in mind about half the people who signed up for my webinar were people who are already on my list. And so you start to say that and say, oh, okay, well, that's good. And then also I sold a bunch of, made a bunch of sales to people through the sales booster. And so when you start thinking about it, probably 3/4 of my sales or more were from, and this is excluding the pre-sale, were to my warm audience. Once you include the warm audience, we're above 80%. Once you include the pre-sale, we're at probably 85% or more of my sales were to my warm audience. And it's always cheaper to get someone onto your list. Right now I'm paying $3.50-ish or so. On average, some days I pay below $3, some days above $4. But that's where I end up about to get someone on my list. And so, if I'm going to spend $15 on a webinar registration, I can get 5 people on my list for that cost, or not quite 5, call it 4.5. That might be the way I need to spend my money going forward. So my ads manager and I are looking at that, and we're thinking we're going to move more of the budget over to list building. That's where we're going to focus on the cold audiences. And then during launches, we're going to focus almost exclusively on warm audience. Try to get my existing folks onto the webinar, and then I can convert them. So that was kind of key learning number 2. That means there's work that needs to be done kind of in the middle here, which before my next launch, to really revamp my list building and ad budget, et cetera, do all of those things. So that's key learning number 2, and we're working on that as we speak. Key learning number 3, this is one that's kind of specific to me, but of my 51 sales, all but one were in the United States. And the one who wasn't in the United States was someone who knew me on my list, didn't really go through the webinar, so not really an issue. And I bring this up because this has been something I've struggled with, right? I'm a US-based lawyer, and people always ask me, are your templates good in other countries? And I can feel confident saying that for the most part, my contracts or my templates would work well in the English-speaking world. So in England, United States, Canada, Australia, because we all tend to kind of descend from the same legal tradition. But, I'll be honest with you, I'm a US lawyer. I always like to say to people that you should, at least confer with someone locally, et cetera. And again, Canadians, I know a lot of Canadians using a lot of my policies who've looked them over, and so they're good there. But the key learning here, and I've always focused my ads on the US only, and I'll continue to do that. But this is something that going forward, I think, I can definitely put my, a stake in the ground that essentially says, look, these are really intended for folks in the US. If you're in the English speaking world, you can use it. But if you're not, let's say you're German. No, you probably shouldn't buy these. And I can just honestly say that to people and not be skeptical, not worry about the fact that I'm maybe losing a market. I've got a big enough market. I should niche that one level further and just be honest about it with my big launch. Now, if people ask me for specific templates and I can answer them more specifically, I will. But when it comes to the signature product, I think I'm just going to say, look, these are intended for folks in the US. You can use them in the other countries, but they're definitely US focused. Now, the next key learning, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but if you follow me, you heard some of this during the launch itself. Technology will fail you. I was launching in a very interesting time. About a week before my actual webinars, my friend Amy Porterfield launched. She had Zoom, the most reliable webinar platform there is, go down the day she was launching. Right as I was closing my cart, Jasmine Starr had the same thing happen to her. Well, I had some difficulties of my own. The day before my webinar, Kartra was down for part of the day. People couldn't register. I couldn't get in on the back end, etc. And that's not really a good time for your system to be down, because that's when I think at that point my ad budget was almost $1,000 for the day. So, or maybe it was $1,000. So, there's a lot of money going out, and there was a couple hours there where people couldn't register. So I probably had a couple of $100 in ad spend that were wasted. But, there's nothing I could do about that. So, if it had continued to be a problem, I might have shut off the ads, but, it got fixed there. Then people had some problems with Webinar Jam, which I was using to deliver my webinar, especially in the first one. Some people had some trouble with like losing connectivity. Most people had no problem, but some people had some problems. So that's going to happen. Then throughout the launch period, periodically, Kartra would give me problems. And it would give me problems by not allowing me to actually change emails, add emails, etc. So that was a frustration. And it was a big problem because, look, my friend Tarzan K talks about this, how during a launch, you should leave some flexibility in your emails. You should have about 85% of your emails already written and queued up, etc. But you should potentially, be ready to write some on the fly, because maybe you're going to hear things, maybe you're going to, want to add something, etc. Now, I had most all of my emails already ready and loaded, but there were a couple of like, okay, well, I'm going to add that email on Sunday, or I'm going to add that email on such and such date. And the problem was I waited until, kind of that time, meaning if I was going to have an email go out on Sunday, I didn't try to write it on Friday and load it up. I waited until, a few hours before on Sunday to try to go into Kartra to add it. That was a mistake. It was a mistake because it added frustration. And ultimately I was able to get all these emails sent. But it was this frustration because it wasn't happening. And because it wasn't happening, it kind of freaked me out. And so I will, in the future, even for those emails I'm going to write on the fly, I'm going to write them, and I say write them, it's more about getting them loaded into Kartra. I wrote them for the most part in a Google document at least a day or so before, but would then try to go and upload it into Kartra a little bit later than I should have. So that's a change I'm going to make. Another problem that came up for me because Kartra had these intermittent problems was I had my emails in the promo sequence for webinar registrants loaded as what are called sequences, rather than each one being a standalone email. Each was part of a sequence and was timed based upon when the email before went out. Normally, that's not a problem, but Kartra was having problems on cart close day. So an email that was supposed to have gone out at 7 a.m. went out at 11. The problem was that was going to mean every future email was 4 hours behind where it should have been, meaning that like the last one was going to go out after the cart closed. So that wasn't going to work. So what I had to do was shut down the sequence and then replicate those few extra emails as standalone emails, or broadcasts as they're called in the Kartra system. Well, you couple that with Kartra having problems and me not being able to get in, you can kind of imagine the frustration I was feeling. Now, if, on the other hand, I had each of these emails loaded as a standalone, what's called broadcast, set for a specific time to go out, I wouldn't have had that problem, because if that first email is delayed by 4 hours, okay, fine. Well, maybe that email and the email after it, are a little bit too close, but everything else is scheduled properly and will still go out the right time. So again, that's a very specific learning, but I think it might apply to everybody, so that if there's a problem with your system at some point, the sequencing could be an issue if you have it set where each email is timed, say 24 hours later, and then 14, and then 10, and et cetera, I will in the future do these all as standalone broadcasts. So each email stands on its own. Again, hopefully it's not an issue that comes up again, but it was something I dealt with, and I consider it a key learning. Now, the final key learning I want to talk about, it's consistent with other things I've said. I haven't implemented it here. I need to add more cowbell to the early parts of my launch. So what that means, and this was something my Facebook ads manager pointed out after we are kind of doing this autopsy. She points out, she says, once people are in my world, they connect with me, they love me, they get this kind of, warm, connection with me. And, I'm lighthearted and all those things. And, she kind of pointed out that we kind of missed the ball on that in the copy for some of the ads. And she took that on herself, said, that was on her, but, I should have thought about it too. And so one of the things we're figuring out is that we need to be much more consistent in, having me and my personality at every point in the funnel, starting with the Facebook ads. And we weren't doing that before. People would get into my world and get into my email sequences as part of this, and they would see that, right? I mean, I had email sequences about fun, and, if you registered for the webinar far enough in advance, one of the emails, I think it was the day before email, I don't remember which one, the title was like Fun with Bobby or something like that. And it was, this joke about that in 24 hours we have the thing. And I assume it's on your calendar as Fun with Bobby, right? Or, something like that. It was a play on words, just make a joke about the fact that this isn't fun. And I was being very lighthearted. And I actually got multiple people emailing back, responding about that, kind of made them laugh, but that no, they did not have my webinar down as Fun with Bobby. But so you get the point. Once people got into my world and onto the list, they were really warmed up with my personality, but we weren't doing that in advance. And so that's a key learning that I take from it and that I think you can learn from. Now, I don't know what cowbell is for you. I don't know what it is to bring more of you into your brand. If you've listened to me, I've been talking about this concept consistently since August, that you need to add more of yourself to your brand. And for you, maybe it's that you're loving or caring or whatever it is, you need to add it and make sure you do it from the get-go. And although my Facebook ads manager, was someone who, she said it's on her, I say it's on me as much as anything else, because I should have conveyed that to her. I should have talked to her about that and said, hey, this is my brand. This is kind of my, my brand personality here. So we need to try to be fun and lighthearted and think through that in the Facebook ads. And her point was, and I think this is true. Going forward, if we focus our messaging more on that and try to really bring my personality and my fun into the very front end, so that people, get to know me from the minute they see that first Facebook ad, that's going to have more of an impact on them. And so that's the final thing I take from it. And it's the final thing that we are going to be working on as we head towards my next launch. So those are the key things I learned. That's a recap of this launch. I hope you found it helpful. If you want to, talk to me about these numbers, or, not have to write them down, be able to get access to my Google Doc that actually has a lot of these numbers that I talked about, I've got that debrief, a link to it in my community. So, make sure to join me there. Again, youronlinegenius.com/community, absolutely free. It's a place where we talk about these things. And this one is a great one. If you have questions about kind of this episode and about my launch, about all those things, jump in there and you can ask me questions. I'm there all the time. Happy to talk about it. But generally that's where you're going to find me and where we can have kind of a two-way conversation. So that's it for this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you back here next week for another episode of the Online Genius Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Online Genius Podcast. Make sure to tune in next week for more great tips, tricks, and strategies to help you build and protect your online genius.